Neti. I'm a senior international relations and politics major here at Carnegie Mellon, and I chose to present for DUC on my senior honors thesis topic, which is social media and conflict resolution. So ever since the beginning of the Arab Spring, mainly, everyone's been talking about social media and how it can be used to foster revolutions and protests, and talking about how amazing it is that we can have this new form of medium that helps us basically facilitate protests and revolutions and stuff. My main question was, though, that's all we're talking about. There's not really any research done on whether social media can be used to actually foster resolutions after a revolution. So basically, after the Arab Spring happened in Egypt, and these regimes were toppled, they actually tried to have a constitution writing program that happened on Twitter. So they tried to write a constitution based on Twitter, and as you might imagine, that kind of failed miserably. So my real question is whether or not we can use social media to actually build governments up and not just tear them down. So initially, my thoughts were to focus on 4 different case studies: Ferguson, Arab Spring, Northern Ireland, and the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Then I realized slowly that these 4 case studies were way too broad for my study to have any internal validity, and not yet broad enough for my study to have any external validity. So I focused specifically on domestic issues and looked at how social media's movements, and decided that they were basically, social media movements are successful when they're coupled with a long history of grievances and traditional social movements, and have those behind them. So I'm looking at the civil rights movement versus the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm looking at the labor movement struggle versus the hashtag Raise the Wage campaign. I'm looking at the Occupy movement as well because I needed a case that didn't have that long history of grievances and history behind it, because no one's really sure what the Occupy movement is actually grounded in, what their core constituency is, while the Black Lives Matter movement and the Raise the Wage campaign does have that and has a long history of these traditional movements behind it as well. So my hypothesis is that these movements are only successful when they have those histories behind them. Some of the issues that I ran into were that there's no real theory to actually guide my research in this space. So the Black Lives Matter movement was a very new movement. It started almost barely a year ago, and there's not been a lot of time, there's not been enough time for it to actually create change or have any real theories to come up along it. Social media is also a very new field of academic research, and so there's not enough time for it to propagate and actually make these theories as it goes, basically. Sorry. So I chose to combat those issues by focusing in on social movements theory specifically. So ground my research in a specific theory of social movements, which is called resource mobilization theory. So resource mobilization theory looks at social movements and social movement organizations specifically through an economic lens. So it turns social movements into organizations, kind of like the NAACP is a social movement organization. SNCC, which was the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee during the Civil Rights Movement, is a social movement organization. The Human Rights Campaign is a social movement organization. And it focuses on those organizations and looks at the goals of these organizations as the product that they're selling to these different people, who are split up into adherents and constituents. So adherents are the people that are interested in this topic, but have not yet been participating in this social movement, while constituents are the people who are invested in this topic and are actually providing resources for the topic. So resource mobilization theory basically says that people are more likely to protest and that these social movements are more likely to have success when these organizations exist, and that they need resources such as money, time, media attention, political attention, and the ability to use all of these resources is another resource that resource mobilization theory looks at. And all these resources are costly to obtain. They take time and effort and have a cost inherent within them to obtain. So what social media does is that actually changes the basic premise of resource mobilization theory, which is that it's based on organizations. So the Black Lives Matter movement is a network. It's not an organization. And resource mobilization theory doesn't take that into account. It doesn't know how to deal with the network surrounding these organizations as much as it does the actual organizations itself. So we really need a new theory and a new way to think about this, but we need to ground it in resource mobilization theory itself. So what does that actually mean? What does being a network actually mean? So it basically means that resources are much less costly to obtain. So the amount of information that we can get through social media is heightened incredibly. The amount of time that it takes for us to get this information is decreased, and the speed with which this information is disseminated is increased completely. It also brings into this effect a self-selection bit, where essentially you're getting this information from a network that you've self-selected into. It's people that you already follow, whose information you already trust. So this information that you're getting is pre-vetted by your network. The other thing is that it's not just information. So since the printing press, to the telegram, to the telephone, to the internet now, we've been looking at faster and faster ways to disseminate information. But it's not just information, because social media also brings into it an access to conversation as well as this information. So you can talk about these different theories, you can talk about these articles that are happening with the people that are in your network whom you already trust. What does that mean for movement specifically? So it reduces the distance, the ideological distance between the in-group and the out-group, between the people that are already in your network and who are already involved in the social movement and the people who aren't involved yet. It reduces the difference between those two groups and makes it easier for people that are interested but not yet involved to get involved. And it also it's a public forum to actually pressure politicians into actually doing work in this space. So essentially, so if you were doing a traditional social movement, you have a letter writing campaign or a postcard writing campaign where you're basically writing these letters to your politician, but you don't know how many letters actually got written. You don't know how many, you don't know what that politician ends up doing with all of these letters in the end. But with social media, it's a public forum, so you can actually see the number of tweets, you can see the number of responses to these tweets, you can see how many people actually care about this issue. But the important thing is, too, you can see how many people care about this issue within that politician's constituency. And it's a lot easier also to see what that politician's response is to this issue. So one of the pitfalls then becomes that now attention, with the number of actual information that you're getting from social media, the amount of information has been risen so much that the attention to a specific social media movement is now another resource that's just as costly to obtain. It's hard to keep people's attention on the internet to a certain issue. So in talking about how these movements are successful, what does success actually mean? So the literature on this really varies a lot. So it's talking about policy changes, it's talking about changes in the policy process itself, changes in social values, and also the impact of these movements on governmental policy and legislation. So in keeping with these different literature, I'm looking at legislation, so I'm looking at the time that it takes for legislation to be proposed to being enacted, the number of proposed legislation surrounding this issue area, and also the number of court cases that are out on this issue area as well, but specifically what these decisions in this area are, and also what those decisions say, what the actual content of these decisions are. And also to measure the shifting of conversation around this. Are we talking about these issues in a different way because of these social media movements? So the data I'm going to be using is specifically Twitter. I chose Twitter because a lot more people are on Twitter in the United States than on Facebook. For legislation, I'm going to be looking at GovTrack legislation data. GovTrack is a website where basically they put in legislation that's proposed, and you can add on amendments to it, and whenever amendments are added, it'll be shown on GovTrack. You can see who voted for it and who didn't vote for it. For court cases, I'm going to be looking at the Supreme Court database, which is a hugely vast, rich database that is organized by both justice, year, issue area, a lot of different things, and it has all the Supreme Court cases from 1945 onwards. The federal court database, looking at lower courts too, is not a database as much as it is a document aggregator, so I'm going to have to do some coding to make that usable as well. And to measure the shifting of conversation, to measure the difference between the rhetoric that we're using based around these issues, I'm going to be looking at the New York Times data. Because getting your movement on the front page of the New York Times is in and of itself a measure of success, but also because the New York Times has a lot of data and you can look at the articles and actually do content analysis to see whether or not the conversation itself is shifting and how we're talking about these issues is shifting. So essentially my big idea is to look at how social media affects the successes of social movements throughout history and looking at this through the lens of resource mobilization theory. And I'm going to be measuring success using legislation and court cases and looking at the shifting conversation. And what I hope to find is that social media movements are fundamentally different than traditional social media social movements, and to provide clear recommendations on how we can actually use social media in order to further subnational conflict resolution, to further the goals of the Black Lives Matter movement, to further the goals of the Raise the Wage campaign, and to further the goals of the Occupy Wall Street movement, whatever those happen to actually be. So that's the end of my presentation. If anyone has any recommendations for me, I'd be glad to hear them, or any questions.
So we're going to open the floor up to questions now. We have about 10 minutes for this, so everybody.
Yeah.
Hi, Satvika. Thank you so much for this very informative presentation, especially for a dinosaur of the internet. Doesn't know anything about it. Well, my question, and I think we've already discussed this kind of, is how do you think, in my opinion, being from the 80s, 90s, how do you think that social media can also affect the success of the movement negatively? For example, let's take the Connie movement, where we felt like there was this huge wave of involvement from American high schoolers, college students, but the involvement was, I'm behind my screen and I'm retweeting, or it's, this virtual community. So how do you deal with this distance between virtual involvement and the real involvement of being, distributing flyers and being really, you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. So it seems like there's two parts to your question. One is what the negative effects of social media are. And that's definitely hugely an important question. So social media tends to polarize people a lot further than mass media does, which tends to moderate people, because it's a forum to talk to people that you already agree with. So it tends to form this echo chamber effect, and you basically end up being more and more polarized in the decision that you already have. And also, like the Coney thing, you have a lot of bad information and misinformation out there as well that can be just as easily retweeted and shared as the good information. But what I think is important about social media is that also it's also a forum for you to counteract that. So there's enough people out there saying, hey, wait, this is actually wrong, and that's how we know about it now too. So it's that, as well as being able to counteract these issues just as they happen too. And for your other point, virtual versus real involvement, so there's actually a lot of studies on that. So lower threshold involvement is talked about as being retweeting or liking something on social media, while higher level threshold involvement is like writing out to your campaign office, or like your politician, or handing out flyers, like you said. But in my opinion, the virtual world is also part of the real world, right? So how is retweeting something different from handing out flyers on the street, where you're still talking to people that it's in your network and you're talking about it to those people. And also, there have been a lot of studies that say that people that are involved in these lower threshold movements are actually more likely to be infused with enough passion and drive to be able to do those higher threshold involvements as well. Yeah, so that's my answer. Yeah.
So how do you feel like, what you just said made me think of the thing after the first Democratic debate where all the major news outlets were saying like Hillary won, even though like all the polls said Bernie Sanders won, and like I felt like social media like called them out on that, was like, no, that's wrong, obviously, and there were all these pictures circulating, screenshots, like these were the poll numbers in the morning that have been deleted.
Yeah.
So like how do you feel like social media movements that like operate on these alternative forums, how do they provide like a counterpoint, or how do they like not undermine, but like kind of provide a more alternative like way to talk about things than like your conventional news outlets?
Yeah, so that example is kind of interesting because it turns out that the reason they actually deleted those poll numbers is because some 4chan or Reddit bots kind of like barraged the polls with Bernie Sanders polls, and that's why they had to delete them and say that Clinton was the winner. Yeah, which is another like interesting avenue for looking at how social media affects these things. But in answer to your question about how it actually affects mass media, so social media, you can use it to actually report on things that the mass media isn't reporting on yet. So if we're looking internationally at the Turkey revolutions, there's this great anecdote that talks about how while these revolutions were happening on the street, the Turkish media center was reporting on a documentary on penguins or something like that. So it really is the forum for people to talk about these things. And it's also kind of is a bypass for like real legislation or real journalism, right? And because people can talk about things as a first-hand thing. We heard about the South Korea ferry collapse through social media from people that were actually involved in it faster than we heard about it from real media or the New York Times. So it's a really interesting avenue to actually look at things from a first-hand experience and also much, much faster.
I guess you don't need the same kind of skills, you don't have to be a
Yeah,
writer.
exactly. It's just you're tweeting about it to people that are already in your network, basically, and it gets propagated from there. Yeah. Yeah.
First up, thank you for the presentation, very informative. In one of your earlier slides, you talked about the difference between breaking down institutions and building up institutions through social media. Could you describe more what you meant by building up institutions?
Yeah, so I guess what I meant was kind of like the example that I gave with Egypt and the constitution writing on Twitter. I'm trying to find ways that we can actually make that work, that we can actually write a constitution on Twitter if we had to, if that was where we were going with that. So kind of like building up the infrastructures and foundations of a real government in the same way that it can be used to topple regimes down, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's much more of an international focus, though, and my focus shifted from looking at all these case studies that were international to looking at domestic issues, just because that's where I had the most experience. Yeah.
I'm curious what you think about how these social media platforms themselves can kind of influence these conversations that are happening. Because, like you mentioned, Twitter is the example that you're using, but in lots of cases, Twitter's internal algorithms surface posts in a certain order, and then they choose to expose certain topics as trending based on whatever internal calculations and metrics they use. And I'm curious if you think these sort of artifacts of, I guess, curation by the service themselves can affect these movements and how they expose themselves to the wider world.
Yeah, I think that really plays a part into the polarization part of it, because Facebook especially has this algorithm where you only see the things on the newsfeed that you're already more likely to like. And if you click on an article, it keeps track of what kind of article you clicked on and gives you more of that, essentially. Which a lot of papers talking about social media and mass polarization don't bring into account, which I feel like is really important. With Twitter, there's a new thing now. Twitter's doing Twitter Moments, right? And where basically they're aggregating all of these hashtags and looking at the important things. But of course, they are curating that with a certain algorithm, and that takes into account biases as well. I don't think there's enough data out there on it just to make a full-formed opinion or study just yet, but it'll be interesting to see how that affects things as we go forward. It's also interesting because Twitter is just a very different platform than Facebook, because Facebook is reciprocal relationships, right? You friend someone, but they have to friend you back in order to have them in your network. While Twitter, you can see who people are following and you can see who people aren't following. You don't have to follow each other to be able to follow them. So it's just an interesting difference of the infrastructure of the social media site, basically. Yeah.
Do you see a difference in how the social networks are being used? So I've heard that Twitter is not doing so well. I know that you're focusing on Twitter for your research, but are you also looking at the culture? Is there anything that took place in Twitter? Or if there's a change, do you see there's also a change in the way it affects social movement, for example?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not really sure I'm focusing on the culture specifically surrounding it, but there is a difference in the way people use it, I guess. So some people use it specifically to share their personal stories, while some people use it as a more political avenue. But I think I'm going to be focusing specifically on the people who are using it as a political avenue in my study, because that is what I care about in looking at how these movements affect success, basically.
I think we have time for one last question. Okay, I have a question. So how do you think that the constituency of the people who are using Twitter affects the success or failure of these social media movements? So we have a tendency to have young people on Twitter and all these social media bases, so based off of that.
Yeah, definitely. Especially with things like the Black Lives Matter movement that started on Black Twitter specifically, right? So it's going to get propagated in the circles of people that care about it. But the interesting thing is too, resource mobilization theory talks about it too, where it talks about adherents and constituents, but also about conscience adherents and constituents. So people who wouldn't be affected by the goals of the social movement being reached, so like white liberals in the Black Lives Matter movement, basically, where they wouldn't be affected by these things coming to fruition, but they are supporters of the movement. And it reduces the difference between the people people that are involved in it and care about it, and people who wouldn't be affected by it but care about it as well. And it reduces that ideological distance, so it makes it a lot easier for those people to be involved in something like that.
Okay, thank you very much.